In November 1998, a Swiss television reporter received a document that would bring the entire Olympic movement to its knees. It was a list of IOC members, the men and women responsible for choosing which city would host the Olympic Games, and next to each name, gifts received, cash payments, free medical treatments, university tuition paid for their children, airline tickets, shopping sprees. The reporter published the story. And within weeks, the International Olympic Committee, one of the most powerful sporting bodies on earth, was fighting for its survival. This is how the Salt Lake City bribery scandal unfolded, and why nothing about the Olympics has been the same since. To understand the scandal, you need to understand the system that created it. Hosting the Olympic Games is one of the most coveted prizes in global politics. Cities that win a bid see billions in infrastructure investment, a flood of tourism, and decades of international prestige. The 1996 Atlanta Games brought in over $5 billion in economic activity. Sydney's 2000 Games reshaped an entire district of the city. The stakes were enormous, and the process for awarding those stakes was almost entirely opaque. Here's how it worked. A small group of men and women, IOC members, traveled the world on inspection tours, visiting candidate cities. Cities wined and dined them. Cities gave them gifts. Cities hired their consultants. And then, in a private vote, those same members decided who would host. No independent oversight, no transparency requirements, no real rules about what cities could offer during the bidding process. Salt Lake City had been trying to win an Olympic bid since 1966. They failed for the 1972 Winter Games. They failed again for 1976, and 1992, and 1994.
I became concerned that what was happening around the Olympics would in some way diminish what is one of the great opportunities on the world stage to lift the spirits of the world.
By the early 1990s, the city had been rejected 4 times. Salt Lake's bid committee leaders had watched other cities win, and they had noticed something. Other cities were more generous. In 1989, the bid committee for the 1998 Winter Games, eventually won by Nagano, Japan, spent an estimated $14 million entertaining IOC members. No one asked too many questions. Salt Lake City decided it was time to play by the real rules. The man at the center of what came next was Tom Welch, the CEO of the Salt Lake Bid Committee, and his deputy, Dave Johnson. Starting in the early 1990s, as Salt Lake pursued the bid for the 2002 Winter Games, Welch and Johnson began what they would later call a scholarship program. IOC members from developing nations had children who wanted university educations. Salt Lake's bid committee quietly paid the tuition. It wasn't a scholarship, it was a payment for votes. Over 6 years, the bid committee funneled approximately $1.2 million in gifts, cash, and benefits to IOC members and their relatives. The list reads like a corruption manual. One IOC member from Cameroon received over $70,000 in cash. An IOC member from Mali had his daughter's college tuition paid. Members received free medical care worth tens of thousands of dollars. There were luxury trips, firearms as gifts, a $10,000 violin.
The Olympic bribery scandal in Salt Lake City. There are allegations the city won the Winter Games for the year 2002 by bribing some members of the International Olympic Committee.
In 1995, Salt Lake City won the bid. They beat out 4 other finalist cities, Sion, Östersund, Quebec City, and Yaka, in a landslide. The city celebrated. The Olympic movement celebrated. No one asked how a city that had lost 4 previous bids had suddenly become so persuasive. No one, that is, until a Swiss reporter got hold of that document 3 years later. When Swiss television aired its report in November 1998, the IOC's initial response was dismissal. This was how things worked, the implied message ran. Gifts were part of hospitality, cultural differences, nothing to investigate. That dismissal lasted about 2 weeks. Investigative journalists across the world, and the United States, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, Australia began pulling on the same threads. The Salt Lake Tribune published a bombshell internal memo from the bid committee that made the payments explicit. American television networks picked it up. Congress started asking questions. The U.S. Department of Justice opened a federal investigation. The IOC, under enormous pressure, launched its own investigation. What they found was worse than the initial reports. It wasn't just Salt Lake City. It wasn't just one cycle. The culture of gifting and payments had been endemic across multiple Olympic bids going back at least 2 decades. Investigators found evidence suggesting that the Atlanta 1996 bid, the Sydney 2000 bid, and the Nagano 1998 bid had all involved irregular payments or benefits to IOC members. The scale of what investigators uncovered was staggering, not just the money, but the brazenness. IOC members had accepted gifts openly, had made requests openly. Some had apparently treated their votes as a commodity to be auctioned.
We do know that there is concern expressed about them. We will find out what we can about the role, effective or otherwise, that they may have played in relation to the candidate cities.
In January 1999, the IOC held an emergency session in Lausanne. The outcome was devastating for the organization's image. 10 IOC members were expelled, the most expulsions in the organization's 105-year history. 6 more were suspended. 4 others received official warnings. Several resigned before formal proceedings could begin. Among those expelled, Agustin Arroyo of Ecuador, Zain El Abidine Ahmed Abdelgadir of Sudan, Jean-Claude Ganga of the Republic of Congo, Sergio Santander Fantini of Chile, and Charles Mukora of Kenya. The list read like a roll call of officials from nations where IOC membership represented one of the most powerful positions a person could hold, and where that power had been systematically exploited. EOC President Juan Antonio Samaranch, who had led the organization since 1980, faced calls for his own resignation. Critics pointed out that the gift-giving culture had flourished on his watch, that the IOC under his leadership had been deliberately insulated from scrutiny. Samaranch survived, but only by promising sweeping reform. Back in Salt Lake City, the fallout was equally severe.
This is a letter the Salt Lake Olympic folks probably didn't want us to get. It raises very serious questions about how Olympic money is being spent, and even about how Salt Lake got the Olympic bid in the first place.
Tom Welch and Dave Johnson were indicted on 15 felony counts: bribery, fraud, and racketeering. The case dragged through the American courts for years. In a result that infuriated critics of the bid process, the charges were eventually dismissed. A federal judge ruled that many of the payments were consistent with normal lobbying activity, and that the prosecution had failed to prove criminal intent beyond reasonable doubt. No one from Salt Lake's bid committee served prison time, but the political and institutional damage was permanent. The IOC commissioned an independent investigation under Canadian lawyer Richard Pound. The Pound Report, published in 1999, confirmed the systematic nature of the corruption and recommended a complete overhaul of the bid selection process. What followed was the most significant reform in Olympic governance history. The IOC created an independent ethics commission. It imposed strict limits on gifts to IOC members. Nothing worth more than $150 could be accepted from bid cities. It prohibited IOC members from visiting candidate cities during the bid process entirely, replacing in-person visits with an evaluation commission that published its findings publicly. It introduced term limits for IOC members. It added external independent members to the IOC for the first time. It also significantly expanded the IOC Athletes Commission, giving athletes, the people the games were ostensibly for, more formal representation in governance. The changes were real. The 2000 Sydney Games went ahead under a cloud, but subsequent bid processes for Turin 2006, Beijing 2008, London 2012 were conducted under far tighter oversight. When another corruption scandal hit, around the 2020 Tokyo bid in 2016, the IOC moved quickly, precisely because the institutional memory of Salt Lake City made inaction unthinkable. The system beneath the scandal. Here's what the Salt Lake City scandal really revealed, and why it matters beyond the specifics of ski jumps in hotel suites. The bribery wasn't an aberration. It was a rational response to the incentive structure that existed. Cities were investing tens of millions of dollars in bid campaigns for a prize worth billions. IOC members had enormous individual power over that outcome and almost no accountability. The system had no transparency, no independent oversight, and no meaningful ethics enforcement. In that environment, the question isn't why bribery happened. The question is why anyone expected it not to. The Salt Lake City scandal was the moment the IOC was forced to confront what institutional corruption actually looks like. Not a few bad actors gaming a clean system, but a clean system that had quietly evolved into something else entirely. And it raised questions that the Olympic movement is still wrestling with today. How much of the reform was genuine, and how much was damage control? When the IOC moved its bidding process reforms in the 2000s, it also simultaneously made the process less competitive. Fewer cities bothered to bid, in part because the costs and scrutiny had become so intense. Recent bids for the Winter Games have sometimes featured only one or two serious candidates. The IOC now operates a system called Future Host Commissions, standing commissions that hold ongoing dialogue with interested cities rather than formal competitive bids. The intention is to reduce the circus atmosphere of traditional bidding. Critics argue it also reduces competition and accountability in a different direction. Is the system now clean? Mostly, the evidence suggests. Is it perfect? The question of who gets to host the Olympics and why remains one where power, money, and political interest still shape the answer, just through different mechanisms than cash envelopes and college tuition payments. Salt Lake City hosted the 2002 Winter Olympics. They went ahead as planned. By most accounts, they were excellent games, well-organized, financially successful, a genuine moment of national solidarity in the months after September 11, 2001. The city that had bought its bid hosted a games that reminded people why they cared about the Olympics at all. There's something almost poetic about that outcome. The corruption was real, the punishment was real, the reform was real. And then the games happened anyway, and people cried watching figure skaters, and none of it could quite cancel out the other. The International Olympic Committee survived the scandal, as it has survived every scandal before and since, because the thing it sells, the idea of the Olympics, turns out to be more durable than the organization that sells it. But for a brief period in the winter of 1998 and 1999, the world got a clear look at the machinery behind the rings, at the men who traveled the world in business class, collecting gifts and tuition payments, deciding which city's dream would come true. It was not a flattering picture, and it was, undeniably, the truth.